Hi guys, this is the first episode at the moment for the Memory Alpha podcast, and we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of Memory Alpha. Memory Alpha started in November 2003, and with us on the panel we have Dan and Harry from USA and the Netherlands, as well as Jan from Northern Germany. I am Florian. I started the German version of Memory Alpha just in, what was it, May 2004. And let's have a little introduction of everyone. We go in alphabetical order, so Dan, Harry and Jan. I'd like to ask you 3 questions, and this is: what is your favorite Star Trek series, your favorite Star Trek film, and what is your favorite Star Trek villain or Star Trek Doctor? For me, the series is, I think, Star Trek Discovery. It's a little strange in the later seasons. And my favorite Star Trek film is Star Trek Search for Spock. Villain. Soren, Dr. Soren. Because he was fighting against Picard and against Kirk. What about you, Dan?
All right, hello, I'm Dan. My favorite Star Trek series is probably still my first one, Deep Space Nine. That was the one that got me to fall in love, and I discovered all the others from there. My favorite film, I'd have to say, is First Contact. I love both sides of that story, the Borg on the ship, but also the optimism of First Contact itself and the story of the Phoenix and Cochrane. Favorite villain that's a tough one, but I'll have to stick with Deep Space Nine and say Gul Dukat.
Or you can choose a doctor, maybe.
I'd say if I was going to have a favorite doctor, I would choose Dr. Crusher.
I'm Harry from the Netherlands, as Florian said. Favorite series? I think I'll keep it old school and say the original series, because that's what started it all. They had the most vision, I think, of all of them, because they thought about Star Trek. Favorite movie? Maybe the motion picture as well. I don't think a movie like that could be made today. They went full science fiction with it. And then favorite doctor or villain, right? For villain, I think Nero from the 2009 movie was very fun. Just a normal guy with some big problems, especially when he met Christopher Pike. Hello, Christopher. I thought that was really funny. And favorite doctor has to be McCoy, because, well, he is the Star Trek doctor, I guess.
Yeah, I think then it's my turn. So my favorite Star Trek series is also Deep Space Nine. So that was what kept me on the track, even though I started with TNG. That was some kind of ritual after coming back from school back then. Yeah, favorite Star Trek film. I think it's The Wrath of Khan. That is exciting. They have the submarine style in there. That was really, really cool to see.
And Spock died.
I watched it much later than in a cinema, of course. So it was already clear that he will resurrect next week when the other movie is played. Yeah, that was when I saw the movie. And favorite doctor, I think this would be Bashir. Going back to Deep Space Nine, I think it's his excitement, and then the arc that he had from the naive young doctor on his first assignment to I'm out in the frontier, and now everything is completely changed to what was years ago.
Yeah, I already said that I started the German Memory Alpha, and maybe I should add that Jan and me both more or less started the German Memory Alpha back in May 2004. But let's start with our journey with Dan and Harry. Who started the original, the English Memory Alpha? Is it true that you started it in November 2003, or is it actually even older than this?
As I recall, it wasn't that much sooner than that. It took a little while, but only by a couple of months. Harry, I remember, was the one who posted the idea on the Flare forum. I had just kind of responded with my own background of working on an individual database for myself. And then from there, we just kind of put it together within a couple of months. So it was a relatively short run up to the actual launch. But there was obviously some, excitement and trials, and there was a false start, as I recall, in the meantime, trying different software. But it did come together relatively quickly.
Well, I posted my original idea on the forums, and Dan was working on his own website, and he had the knowledge about hosting and running the software. We came together via the forum, and then, we tried a few different types of wiki. We settled on it being a wiki quite soon, I think. Yeah, and then in November, we invited more people via the forums, I think. And then after a few weeks, we really launched officially.
Why did you choose a wiki? Because I think there were things like this, Star Trek encyclopedias or Star Trek databases before. And what was the idea behind the wiki?
Well, for me, back in those days, a lot of people made their own websites, something that doesn't really happen that much anymore. So there were a lot of Star Trek fans that made their websites. One person made a website about starships, one made it about aliens. So everyone had their own little niche. And I also had my own website. And my experience was it's fun for a few months, and then you lose interest and do something else. And all these great databases were never finished, really. Wikipedia was about 3 years old, maybe, at the time. So
I had never heard of Wikipedia when you brought that up, so I had to go look that up myself. That's how new it was. Yeah, just a few years old.
So my idea was if everyone is working in the same database, then if someone loses interest, there's probably someone else who can take over.
Yeah, Dan is actually running his own website, is it?
It's mostly dead, but not all dead. I still update it. I keep putting little things every now and then, a blog post, or I add a few things for reference, but not regularly.
Who came up with the name Memory Alpha?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it's from an episode, right?
Yes, of course. I know the behind the scenes explanation, but you could have chosen any other name.
Yeah, I think it happened early in the process, but
I actually don't have a memory of why we chose that either, to be honest.
No.
But I think
it just felt right, I guess.
Yeah, it's the natural thing that you come up with. I think there have been different memory alphas before, not in the digital sense as we experience it today, but memory alpha is just that database name for Star Trek stuff.
And then Harry ordered the domain, or?
For the first couple of months, it was on my website. I just set up a subdomain as we were getting things up and running. And then after that, Harry got the domain name and we moved it onto its own server.
Chris Trigwell made us a logo at that time as well.
Yes.
He also made logos for your website, I think, or your hosted his designs.
I'm hosting his designs. He was just posting and sharing on the forums, and I asked, would he like me to make a gallery to put them all together because they were just so well done? And then I asked, hey, could you make one for Memory Alpha? And 20 years later, we're still using it.
The designer is going by the name Reverend in the Flair format, is it right? Yeah.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, he made a lot of good logos. Yeah, totally.
And then, Harry, you ran the website on your server, and I think you even asked for donations in the first few weeks or months. I don't know how long that went on your side.
Yeah, it ran on Dan's server, but with donations for a while. I seem to remember that we didn't really break even with that. I think it costs more to host back in those days than it does today, and we didn't get that many donations, I think.
So you lost money on that enterprise?
Yeah, I think some months it worked and some months it didn't, and I think we were both students at the time, at least I was.
I was too.
Yeah, and then hosting moved. I don't know if you want to go into that now or
else. I think we moved to Wiki Cities was the name back then.
I remember even from the very early days, I think we had some discussion, or there was discussion on Wikipedia, like, why isn't this just part of Wikipedia? Why are you making your own thing? Because we have the big encyclopedia. So that was a very brief discussion. And another thing I remember is that I personally, on the very first days, I never really saw it as just canon Star Trek. Just, we might as well describe everything. But I think we very quickly decided, no, we just stick to canon, add the animated series, because why not? And then I don't really know when Memory Beta started. But
I remember part of that discussion about deciding what was going to be included and what wasn't. And at the time, I remember we were drawing very heavily on resources like the hardback Star Trek Encyclopedia, and trying to find references and to keep it consistent between all the books, because some of us have read certain books but not others, and some haven't read any books. Trying to make it approachable, trying to make Memory Alpha approachable so that everybody could contribute to it. I recall that was something that I think that was kind of why we tried to steer towards the canon side of things. Combining that with creating the narrative consistency of the articles from Memory Alpha, trying to write them out as if they were an actual encyclopedia. It was something where we needed to figure out what are we going to include and what aren't we, because a lot of the novels, I did read novels for a while and they were great, but fitting them into the story of what happened in the episodes themselves was something that would have been really difficult at best. And I suppose part of it was a limitation of the software, because at the time it was just all one giant page, one long page. So we couldn't really have this part is the canon material, this part is the licensed material. Now I know that Wiki software has options for showing, like, here's the new canon, here's the old canon, as you know, some of the other fan wikis have. Information like that.
And what draw you to the conclusion to also include the animated series? It's absent in the official encyclopedia. That was, I think, controversial at that time, right?
It was at the time, and I remember thinking I hadn't even seen it because it was hard to get. I don't even remember when it had come out on DVDs, but it hadn't come out, or I hadn't had the money to buy it. But I figured it's a TV show. It's about Star Trek, and they did have all those little sparse references to the show. So I figured, let's include it. And because of the wiki format, we can remove it later on if we decide we don't want to. But I suppose in its own way, the fact of including it then kind of led to its rehabilitation. Maybe just a small part of that, but I know that as time went on, it was embraced more and more by the powers that be.
Is the animated series in the official the print encyclopedia today, or still not?
I don't know about the last edition of it, if that was or not. But but there was a big gap between the last one that was published in, I want to say, 1999, and then the late 2000s edition, or 2015, somewhere around there.
But it was produced by the same staff, and it was including all the original actors, except for
Chekhov.
Yes, except for Chekhov. Oh.
Okay, I was on the main page of the English version of Memory Alpha, and I looked up the first version, and it was from November 23rd. It said Memory Alpha consists of 770 articles. That was way before we included the variable where you see the actual number. So it was written by hand, 770 articles. And I was wondering if maybe Dan or Harry already wrote about 800 articles and just included this in the first version of the Memory Alpha.
As I recall, that was a big part of the early stages of setting up Memory Alpha, was just creating the skeleton of it. We needed to have a page for every episode, and that was a lot of work at first. I remember I kind of moved over some things from my own personal database, manipulating text, creating the wiki text. That was a lot of work and a lot of text massaging. So there were a lot of those pages and edits that had to be created. So I'd be willing to bet that at least half of those articles were probably just placeholders for the episodes themselves. And then people would go into an episode and link and say, all right, Spock was in this episode, create the link for Spock, and then it could, expand from there.
Funny that you mentioned this, because I actually dug up something I did 20 years ago on the German version, and that is actually also my way to approach this thing. So I was writing the help pages, the internal Memory Alpha pages, the boilerplates, and then I started with all the episode lists.
Yeah, and then came me. So I just had to look up. So I expanded your Next Generation page with listing all the different pages there, and bringing the Star Trek content in there. I remember you trying to stop me editing, and while you were still setting up the environment. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things that really, I think, was so successful about the wiki format, was just exactly what you were doing, Jan, is that you see this project and you think, oh, I don't have to do it all myself. I can focus on just the parts that I'm interested in and write a few articles about that and then move on. It was definitely very scary because of the idea of not being so protective of the whole project, letting other people say what they want, and it doesn't necessarily match your own view of what is in the show. And from all of that, it took a while. And I know that there was a lot of, Florian, you mentioned the boilerplate and the help articles, because so many people just didn't even know how Wikipedia worked. So I do remember putting a lot of those guideline articles up to kind of help inform people who may or may not have chosen to actually read those pages, but at least we had a reference to point to help kind of set some guidelines that we could at least all agree on.
Just a question. Now that you mention it, I know I copied this more or less, or translated this from the English Memory Alpha. Where did you get your reference for the policies and guidelines?
From Wikipedia and a couple of the other early wiki websites. Mostly Wikipedia, but I think there was another general purpose wiki that was using different software, but that had some community going at the time.
So we are standing on the shoulders of giants.
Absolutely. That was something that, Wikipedia was the first general purpose encyclopedia, and I don't know if Memory Alpha was literally the first fan wiki, but I think it was definitely the first one that really took off.
Yeah, I was actually looking at that today, because there were a couple of wikis around at the same time. The Battlestar Galactica one, the Star Wars one, the World of Warcraft one. Those were all early wikis, but I think the earliest one I found started in 2004 for Warcraft. So I think Memory Alpha might at least one of the first. Let's say that.
We're on the top 10. Let's agree on that.
Yeah.
And we are constantly linked on the official Wikipedia pages. If you want to have more information, have a look in Memory Alpha.
Harry, you mentioned that Memory Alpha moved from the private server to the commercial server. I just say commercial server because, WikiCities is more or less a commercial company. But WikiCities has some connection to Wikipedia or Wikimedia. Can you describe this?
As I understood it, the founders of WikiCities were also members of the Wikimedia Foundation or Wikipedia Foundation. I think we were first contacted by Erik Muller, I think what he provided was basically a managed hosting for Memory Alpha with the trade-off that we would have some Google ads on the side. That's how it started. But then he would host it for us and I think keep it updated for us, the software.
So it was never an ad-free or non-commercial product?
Only when we hosted it ourselves. And then it moved to Wikicities.
On Memory Alpha, you have a certain license for the content, for the text content.
Share alike is not in there. It's just Creative Commons by and non-commercial.
And you chose the non-commercial part to appease the license holder of Star Trek, the franchise?
Basically, yeah. I mean, as I remember, I was doing some research. Wikipedia at the time had a different license. They were using, I think, the GFDL license. And even at that time, there was some discussion about that not being a great license for Wikipedia. So I was already, seeing some information about Creative Commons. So that seemed very attractive. And I remember thinking that at the time, the most reasonable thing to do would be to make it non-commercial to help appease and to hopefully reassure the Paramount lawyers that this is not something where we're trying to make money. And from that, we just kind of put that license in there. And I don't think any of us really considered quite how long-term this project would be, because we have legally been, kept with that license. I don't think it's really hurt us too much. But at the same time, there have been a couple of, conflicts, because I know between Memory Alpha is on the BY NC license, Memory Beta is on the BY SA license. Which is what most of the rest of the fandom wikis now are on as well. So it's a trade-off, a little bit inconvenient, but within Memory Alpha itself, it's not a huge deal.
If you would have known that Memory Alpha would become a big name, would you have hosted the service on your private server?
I think at the time it probably was too expensive. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I did not have I was in college and I didn't have a regular job until, 2005 after college. And even then, of course, I had other obligations and such. So I didn't really have a whole lot of budget to maintain that. So there was definitely a real attraction to that. Do I have some regrets about that? A little bit, yeah. Would I love to be still, a little bit more, hold on to that and shepherd it to keep it a little bit more focused without all the distracting ads? Yes, would have loved to keep that. But I don't think there was any practical way that we could have gotten that, because it did just grow so big with all the server requirements.
Yeah, and of course the server updates and software updates. If you would start it now, obviously it would be hosted in the cloud, some kind of virtual host, not very expensive. But back then, web hosting was a bit more involved. You had to have a dedicated server, I think. Yeah.
And Harry, you mentioned server updates or software updates, and that just reminded me of the time fairly early on when I botched one of the software updates for the Wikimedia software, and it literally, we lost 6 weeks worth of updates of the content for Memory Alpha. That was in early 2004, first half of the year at some point. So it was still relatively new. So it felt really scary. And I was like, oh my goodness, what did I just do here? And, of course, at that point, there were enough contributors that we kind of recovered relatively quickly. So at this point, it's just a footnote, but that was the sort of thing that we had to deal with to maintain all of that software. And I was, I have a personal interest in technology, but I didn't have any experience running a server. And so, I was just trying to figure it out as I went along.
Yeah, I remember it was almost like a new start, basically, from there. But yeah.
And do you know? Do you remember the timeline, Harry? So you founded Memory Alpha in 2003, and I just looked it up. Wikicities was founded in 2004. So you ran the server for more or less a year.
I think so, yeah.
And you got contacted from Wikicities at that time?
They came to us to help us hosting with this wiki, maybe because we were one of the visible MediaWiki installations out there.
I know that I was in touch with one or two people at Wikimedia because I was trying to figure out how to get the software to work, and it was relatively brief conversations, but I think that's how they became aware of us. And then as Memory Alpha started to grow, then there were more people, and they realized, oh, this is actually a successful use of our software.
I vaguely remember that there were downloads for the database. So I could download the complete Memory Alpha database and then have this database installed locally on my computer and play around with it.
That I think that was a general service because I remember that I connected a bot that was using exactly this feature, that you could download the database, crawl it, and then search for typos, missing links, correcting links, and so on. I think that was a standard feature of the software, actually.
I think so too, because I'm pretty sure Wikipedia had that back before Wikipedia was too big to download.
So the database itself is just the text, but it's accompanied by all the media, and I think that is what's still today the more expensive stuff. For the database, it's more like providing fast access and that pages load fast, that the content can be rendered correctly. But
as I recall, I mean, early on when we were starting Memory Alpha, we definitely focused a lot on text, and there weren't a whole lot of pictures. It was usually most articles didn't have any pictures at all, and then there were some articles that would have just one picture, and that was enough. And some of the longer ones you'd add 2, maybe 3, but that was usually about it. Now I think it's great because it definitely makes the material a whole lot more immersive and easy to follow along, where you have, so many images to illustrate. Like for character articles, I love how they have both their first appearance and their last appearance. So you can see what they looked like, for comparison. That's a neat idea that I no idea who had that whenever they started doing that in the template. That was a neat way to help integrate media into those biographies. But we didn't really focus on that in the early days, just wanted to have the content, the text itself.
I just had a look. Jörg joined in September 2005, and he has 18,000 edits. So.
Oh, is that all? Oh, Jörg is unstoppable there. It's awesome. I know that with a lot of my early edits were just little maintenance things, so that was something that kind of built up over time. Although honestly, the things that I'm most proud about with helping to get started was that by starting from the Star Trek Encyclopedia, all of those entries were just so incredibly short. If you had a 4-sentence entry, that was long. And so there were so many summary details in there that got lost. And I wanted to really flesh out that. It also helped. I was in college. I was a history major, so I loved the potential for storytelling to help weave together these events from one episode to another to another. And I think an early example that really kind of set the tone was I wrote a big chunk about the Klingon Civil War in Next Generation. So I started writing it literally like a history essay. and telling the story of how Chancellor Kempek was dying or assassinated, and then the struggle for leadership between Gowron and Doras, and then the events of the Redemption two-parter and the actual conflict. And so I think with those types of stories, that's what really excited me, was to be able to make it not just a complete encyclopedia, a complete reference, but also that we could use it to tell these long form stories to help put in as much detail and interpretation as was necessary to help make it a more complete reference. And I think that really worked well. There were a lot more articles that came after that one.
Yeah. Was this when the featured articles were started?
Possibly. I know featured articles is probably another thing we borrowed from Wikipedia, but would be around that time probably.
Yeah, what I also really liked about those days is you could clearly see different people having different interests and really focusing on their part of Star Trek. Like I myself was always obsessing with aliens and especially the Federation members, and I really liked fleshing out some of the animated series stuff. And yeah, you made like historical articles about what actually happened. And I also remember people like Charles Trotter, who somehow found out everything about background extras and every actor that ever appeared, wrote whole articles about them. I thought that was really amazing. Like, okay, here's someone, you see him for 5 seconds. This is who he is. This is all the other people he ever acted with.
When did this start? That there were some articles without name, so character articles without name. It was, I think, episode and then a tilde sign and then 1, 2, 3, 4 for every piece of person. A foot, a hand. They made screenshots and enlarged the screenshot to see there's a foot of someone. We don't know who it is, but we have to document it.
I think that was someone's obsession at the time. So yeah.
Yeah,
I forget when that started.
I also remember there was already a page out there where they did this for the original series and discovered, for example, that there were recurring characters that had 1 or 2 or 3 names, died, were resurrected, and stuff like this. And I think that was then also put into Memory Alpha.
Yeah, I think those kinds of lists predate Memory Alpha, to be honest, because I think there have always been efforts to find out how many people were actually on the Enterprise. Like, how many different faces do we see?
I'm pretty sure it's a fan project there. I know there were several early projects. I remember one that was trying to document every crew person's name on Voyager, because they weren't getting any crew rotations
that
for
was
people
an interesting
joining
one.
the ship.
And they had only 150 people on board, so at some point you have seen all of them.
And speaking of torpedoes, or was it shuttlecrafts? I think there is a recurring joke of they came to the Delta Quadrant with how many shuttlecrafts? 4, 5, 6?
They lost one every second episode. They lose a shuttle, I think. Yep.
And half of them were crashed by Chakotay. Yeah, I wasn't literally counting, but it sure seemed like it. But thanks to Prodigy, now we know there's a vehicle replicator.
Yeah, great series.
So this is just one of the things I loved, is all these little niche corners, different aspects of it, and it's something that just kind of passes the time, and you're able to just learn a little more about it. And even the producers, the people making the show, they don't always have the time to plan these things out. And so sometimes you end up with, 200 faces appearing on a ship with 150 people, 17 shuttlecraft lost. But then you can come up with stories and ways that actually fits in. So it's always fun to see those things that is like, no, I never noticed that, but somebody else did.
Yeah, I wouldn't know about Lieutenant Leslie without Memory Alpha. It's a 30 kilobyte article, and he's just a red shirt in the original series.
Dan, you mentioned you wrote an essay on the Klingon War. Where did you get the information about that? Was it from the books, from the encyclopedia?
It was from the encyclopedia and from the episodes. So I was basically recounting the events that was in the episode, but then I was definitely adding a little bit of interpretation in some ways. But for the most part, it was really just a summary in a way. But rather than just having the summary of the events episode by episode, it was a summary of this theme, this story arc as it progressed across all of those stories.
Yeah, I think the Star Trek Encyclopedia and the Chronology were the two main books that was basically the source of canon.
Mm. Which variants of this do you have?
The first and second of both.
Okay.
I think, yeah, there.
Yeah.
Mine are downstairs, but I've got the first three encyclopedias, one of the chronologies. Oh, and the technical manuals.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Next Generation and Deep Space Nine technical manuals.
And my first edition encyclopedia has completely fallen apart because I've read it too much.
Yeah. Do you also have notes in there?
Yes, I have. I have.
Guilty. Yeah.
Well, that's actually, to talk about the encyclopedia for a little bit, that's actually where I got my start with just the idea of cataloging these things. So in the mid-90s, I was using, the encyclopedia, and that was my primary resource because that was before the internet was terribly widespread. So I was creating, first I started a spreadsheet. And then from there, then I used database software on my family computer called FileMaker Pro. My dad used the family computer for work as well, so I had access to this fairly fancy program. I made sure to make it look like the LCARS interface, and so I had a long list of every ship that was listed in the encyclopedia. Then I started a list of every episode, started making lists of characters and such. So it was all very interactive, and I was building it solely for my own enjoyment. As time went on, like around 1999, 2000, I started thinking, how can I share this? But the software was several $100s, so it was something that was very difficult to share. That was when I started my website as a kind of alternative, thinking maybe someday I'll put my database up there too. Then came along the Memory Alpha project.
Yeah, I also remember very clearly, I grew up with the Next Generation, and then someday I saw in the shop one of the posters of the Enterprise D, the cutaway poster. And that's the moment I realized, wait a minute, they've actually thought about this. This ship actually makes sense, and there are places in the ship that are actual places. There's a bridge, transporter room. You can go there, they figure out how that works. So that's the moment for me where Star Trek suddenly became like, okay, you can think about this and you can think about how this universe works. Yeah, and especially interesting was that it showed all the previous Enterprises. And hey, I know the first one, I know this one, but there are Enterprise C, Enterprise B, what's that? I never saw those movies or episodes. Maybe I was too young to understand it. So that really got the imagination going from, okay, this is a whole ship and thousands of people and all kinds of other ships. In 1999, we got an internet connection at home. And I remember one of the first people I spoke to about Star Trek was Bernd Schneider from Ex Astra Scientia. So, and via him and some mailing lists and stuff like that, I discovered Flare. And a few years later, it was Memory Alpha.
Also, the very same. So I also had this poster. I think we are talking about exactly the same poster, same encyclopedia, chronology. I didn't have the technical manual though, but I had a book about background information in Deep Space Nine, and that is actually the thing that is most worn next to the encyclopedia.
Jan, is that the one with the making of, where they talk about like the early scripts and the production of the show?
From Deep Space Nine, yes.
Yeah.
With
lift
concepts.
it a little higher. Oh, yep, I have that same book. Yes.
concept drawings of this, and yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. Show me more.
What do you want to know? Alien background images?
How they built the station?
Yes, wonderful. So creative. I just wished at that time that I could draw with that quality, to draw some spacecraft and design on spacecraft. But yeah, my strength was finding errors in other people's work.
Everybody's mentioned Bernd Schneider and Ex Astra Scientia and Flare. I think that's really a common part here. Of course, obviously, Flare is where that's kind of the nexus point, because that's when Harry brought up the idea. So we all have a connection there anyway. But I mean, I'm still amazed at how strong Ex Astra Scientia is going, and that Bernd lets that, to talk about some of the technology and the background materials. So fascinating there. The observations I'm still amazed by. And I know that's a lot of that is Jörg also.
Yeah, Jörg's observations can be a whole podcast in itself.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of database he uses, but it's on a different level.
I think the database is pen and paper. I asked him about this once.
Really?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Were you also active on the Trek BBS at that time? I think we didn't talk about advertisement yet, or advertising to get new contributors in there. So
that's right. Yeah, the Trek BBS. That was another community that I posted at the time, and I think that's actually one of the first places that we put in an announcement that. When we were trying to solicit, like publicly to get people to just start casually dropping by. Trek Today, that was their associated news site. So posting, contributing an announcement there and getting people from some of the other message boards to join in. I remember we kind of took it slow. We wanted to make sure that we didn't, have too many people all at once. So we started just me and Harry, then we brought in a few other people from Flare, and then we started announcing it to Trek Today and Trek BBS, and then there were a few other places after that. And then the word of mouth just naturally spread. I'm trying to remember when the first actual credits for Memory Alpha started happening. I know that there were a couple of novels in the mid 2000s, and I know that Mike Sussman was contributing materials towards the last season of Enterprise.
Just looked that up, by the way, today. He joined very early on, and he's been active since quite recently. So I think that was one of the first times someone from actual Star Trek noticed us. And I also remember early on, we got an email from the people from B. Joe Trimble about some kind of detail on your website is wrong. Can you fix it? I still remember that because, people were getting noticed now. That's interesting.
Memory Alpha grew in popularity not only with the fans, but also with the production side and with the writers' room. And I think Memory Alpha is now one of the most important resources if you want to build on the legacy of Star Trek, because how many series and how many films do we have now with Star Trek? It's a tremendous amount of time and stories you have to keep in your mind to have to build on your show or your next series or your next episode. And do you want to speak now about your big moment of fame you had with Star Trek, or do you want to stretch it out until later?
Sure, we could talk about it now.
Yeah. I do remember that before that happened, we got a message from the production office or whatever of the first movie. Again, about some information that was not correct. So I think that was the first contact with the new movie producers. But yeah, then came, what was it, 2015, 16?
15, yeah.
That was a strange Tuesday afternoon.
It was. I actually saw Harry's email first about that, and then I looked at my inbox and I happened to be off that day, and the email subject literally said, "From Simon Pegg." And I thought, okay, really?
Actor, writer, producer Simon Pegg. So I think he also attached an image, so you could be sure that it's not something pretending being Simon.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
so we knew.
Mm-hmm. That's how the email started, with a big picture of him holding a. Yeah.
And you know, we'd already known that he was co-writing the movie, but the email was describing how he'd been using it for all of the references, you know, to make sure that everything kind of fit in, even though it was a different universe, you know, different timeline, I should say. But it was still keeping it consistent with, you know, names and places and technology. And then he was asking for us to contribute to an idea that he had for an element in the story.
Did you know the name of the movie? I think later on it was released as Star Trek Beyond.
Yes, no name was mentioned. But what was kind of funny, we had to sign a document.
Yes, of course. Non-disclosure agreement.
Non-disclosure on penalty of losing our jobs with the movie or something.
Okay.
And that actually had a code name for the movie. I don't really remember something. I don't remember.
You have to double check your NDA, not that you lose your job.
I might still lose my job.
Mm.
Please censor this part of the. That was kind of funny. He gave us some description of what they needed or what role the element played in the movie that they wanted a name for and a little bit of background. So I think we hashed it out in a few hours.
It was just a few hours. I mean, he was basically, what Simon Pegg was asking for was a unique Vulcan mineral that they could detect by sensors. And that was about all he gave us. But he needed a name and he wanted some technical qualities about it. Harry had the idea of the technical aspects of it, as I remember.
The first thing I thought about was, okay, Vulcans and some kind of radioactive element. So the first thing I thought of was their history of the time of awakening with basically nuclear war. And then I started researching that a little bit. And it turned out that people actually made jewelry from radioactive glass from the Trinity explosions in the 50s. So it was a real thing that happened. In the 1950s in the US, they exploded one or more nukes in the desert and the sand turned to glass. And before people really understood how dangerous that is, at least some of that was sold as jewelry. So, I mean, if you Star Trekify that into, well, it's radioactive with some kind of signature that's specific to Vulcan. And of course, Starship sensors can track that over distances. That was my idea about it.
How did you communicate, basically? Is that in a chat or on the phone, or?
I think it was a whole lot of frantic emails back and forth.
It was a lot of emails.
Yeah, and then you came up with the name, I think, from...
Yeah, I was looking at a bunch of different websites that had Vulcan information on them. Different names. Some of them were official names. I definitely checked Memory Alpha for some of the Vulcan words that were used, especially from the episode Amok Time. I remember there was one that was like, there were at least 2 hyphens in the name, because I was thinking of Kunut Kalifi, but that was definitely a little too long. Gradually, we kind of worked back and forth, came up with a list of ideas, but the top of the list was the name Vokaya. Now, it was just between the two of us. We definitely were using other resources for the list. And so I think the word vocal was a Vulcan word for like remember or something. And so we were kind of developing that into saying, well, maybe we have like a memory stone or something like that.
Yeah. I think the second half was something like Mount Salea, something mountain-like.
Yeah, Vocal Haya maybe was where we were going to it, and then we shortened it further. In retrospect, a memory stone is a great gift to give to your girlfriend, as long as she doesn't know it's a tracking device. And we didn't know anything about that. We didn't know that it was, Uhura's necklace. We didn't know any of the context about why they were tracking it or who was using the material or who had it. We knew nothing of that until we saw the movie. The closest we got was when they released some of the teaser material and they showed the scene where Uhura tries to give the necklace back. And Harry and I were then emailing back and forth again, and we were asking each other, is this it? You think this is what we were working on? And it turned out yes, but we did not know.
You met Simon Pegg at the premiere of the movie?
I did, yes. So we got an invitation only 10 days before the premiere.
Okay.
So it was very, very short notice to go out to San Diego to watch the movie. And basically some people at Paramount had seen, because Simon Pegg did give some interviews. He'd been talking in general terms about referencing Memory Alpha. And so they found out about it and somebody decided to invite us. I was sure I couldn't, make it because of my job. I already had my schedule for that week. But I had some amazing coworkers and managers at the store, and they said, "Yeah, we can make this work." So I was able to go. Mm-hmm. And Harry, I don't know if you even had the remote consideration of being able to go.
No, very briefly, but it was too short notice and way too expensive.
Yeah, the plane tickets and so on.
Yeah, but I would have given up my job to go there if it wasn't that expensive. I have to go. Bye.
Yeah.
But no, sadly, it didn't work out that way. But I was, I think, via Skype.
But yeah, when you said you couldn't go, I thought, we've got Skype, we've got FaceTime. I can do something from the phone. So I said, at the very least, had to make sure that you were there for that.
Yeah. For me, it was 4:00 in the morning on the red carpet. And then afterwards, I had to go to work.
But you slept that night before, or?
Somewhat, yeah. But for you, you had the whole day there, or an evening, or?
Yes, yeah. We flew out the day before. I had a friend come with me, so we flew out the day before, and then because it was 7 p.m. or so on the west coast of U.S. and hanging out on the red carpet with a couple of the folks from Wikia, which was the name at the time. It was Wikicities, then it was Wikia, then it was Fandom. They've gone through a couple of iterations over the years. And then watching the parade of all of the stars and producers going by. And Simon Pegg was one of the last. And we had, 5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it was a great conversation just to meet him and talk for a couple of minutes and catch up, and then got to see the movie.
Did you ask him why he asked you, both of you, for the plot device or for the name of the thing?
He did say in the original email that it was kind of a thank you gesture in a way to kind of recognize the fan contribution. The one thing that we didn't get any direct input as to, because our names did appear in the credits. If I'd had any input, I would have said, could you put Memory Alpha in there also?
Yeah, I would have also liked to have seen Memory Alpha there. Because, of course, we just started this and then all the other people made Memory Alpha.
How long did you stay active on Memory Alpha?
I stopped actively contributing around, 2006. So what's that, 3 years or something? And I actually found my own post saying it, because the reasons I gave then were there's no more Star Trek on TV. And I was obsessed with things like Battlestar Galactica and Lost. So, and okay, also editing a wiki can be quite addictive. You can spend a lot of time in it, correcting each other and adding new things and clicking every non-existent link and writing a little article. So yeah, I stopped at some point, and then
it was similar for me. It was around 2006, give or take, and I got a little burned out. That just writing more material, maintaining, editing. It got to the point where it didn't feel as fun, and it felt a little more like a chore. But because there were so many other people contributing, and we had several other admins at that point, I just kind of gradually faded away a little bit into the background. I never stopped visiting. I visit, if not daily, multiple times a week. Especially now that there's, new material on finally again over the last 5 years. Beyond the movies. I mean, can't overlook the movies, but they were just like one-time events. So I was always going, looking on the website to refer, for conversation, for my own memory to refreshing my knowledge. But actually editing and contributing was something that I just kind of stepped away from.
Which is, of course, exactly the whole point of Memory Alpha. Someone else probably takes over, because Star Trek fans are very meticulous about their fandom. There will always be someone wanting to make lists of things, I think.
Yeah, I also had to look it up. So it was also around 2006, 2007. Back then I moved, and I just didn't have time. I just finished my bachelor degree. Plus, I think back then there was also the event where they had the auction of all the background material. And I think this also started whole new discussion, because we as the fans finally had access to all this material and no longer had to rely on the books. I don't know if I mix it up right now, but
you're referring to the Christie's auction, right, Jan?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I remember that there was a discussion about the Picard Family album, where we finally saw all this stuff, and then stuff was put in there and removed, and we had edit wars and yeah.
All of those tiny details that were way too small to see on the screen, but now we had pictures of the props.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's nice to have a lot more of that these days with the new series, where producers are able to share in the moment. I know that it's kind of a mixed blessing in a way, but I remember last year with season two of Picard, no recent spoilers, but there was the massive fleet, and within a day or two, one of the producers was publishing, the names of the ships and their registry numbers and their classes, and we were seeing pictures. And I still have memories of meticulously assembling the ships of Wolf 359, cataloging and trying to reverse engineer what did the original ship look like before it was wrecked. Now all that material is at our fingertips on social media within a couple of days. And on one hand, it's great to be able to catalog all that. On the other hand, having, we kind of lose the opportunity to do a little bit of our own original research there.
Exactly. So I saw the exact very post, and I was also shocked. Okay, I remember the Wolf research project. I was not involved, but it was amazing what was put together as a joint research project there.
Yeah, I do remember, Wolf 359, especially the secrecy around the pictures. Like, here's a study model on a coffee cup. Don't share this picture, but this is what we used. Yeah, that was a different time.
But actually, if you ask people, at least that is my experience, they are quite open to it. I also had a look, and my first article was this Xinti article from the animated series. Back at that time, there were rumors that the Xinti were supposed to be in season 5 of Star Trek Enterprise. There were pictures floating around. I tracked down the guy who made this, and he was quite open with the material. He wanted to have it in there, actually. It's also a nice feeling to see that the production team cares about the fans. That is probably what also kept me that long with Star Trek.
I was always wondering when we would receive a cease and desist letter from, I think, Paramount at this time. For the pictures we included in Memory Alpha, I was always a little on the careful side, for including more pictures than necessary. But I think Paramount never came up with the cease and desist or with some lawyers, did they?
I have to give them a lot of credit that, at least just observing from other fandoms, I know there have been some companies that are very particular about that. And I think that they seem to recognize, the benefit of having this material. I mean, I've always wondered why StarTrek.com, the official website, might not have had, so much more. Memory Alpha maybe could have been some part of that at some point. Except, and they did have their own databases, but they were very abbreviated and not even as complete as the paper encyclopedias. But that just kind of demonstrates the reason why Memory Alpha was created. It's too much work for any one person or even one company if you're throwing resources out at it, because then they have to spend the money to pay the people to do it. And then there becomes the question of ownership, who owns the text and everything. I think it's great that they're able to do that, and they've been able to take a hands-off approach. Combine that with the fact that the producers are pretty much all fans, because Star Trek has had such a long-term influence on society that, pretty much everybody who works for it is a fan of the show in some way. And we can all be fans for different reasons. We all love our different series. We all love our different characters. We all have different interpretations on certain controversies. But at the same time, we all know why we love to do this. And getting those contributions from the producers so that they can create and provide, and share material with the fans. And then the fans and all of their obsessions and list making and cataloging then feeds back to them. So it's definitely a mutually beneficial relationship there. And it seems like whether it's an accident and oversight or whether it's a deliberate policy at some level, it's definitely worked out very well for everybody, I think.
Yeah, and I think these days it's become a part of so many media, like every series is now part of a universe. Look at Marvel, or the Star Wars universe is expanding as well. So I think it's more or less expected now that you need a wiki to even understand which character is which. Or at least they all like to service that kind of fandom. Like, oh, you remember this and you know this character, and we will use them in the series to tell their stories. Yeah, I think that kind of connected universe is really the norm now, maybe.
Memory Alpha is the people. It's the collective. Can we use that word?
Resistance is futile.
And it's addictive. You cannot get out.
What about the domain? There once in a time there was a domain called memory-alpha.org. We don't own the domain anymore, do we?
No. That happened in 2008. I think it was about the time when the domain had to be renewed for a couple of more years. And then Wikia was concerned maybe that they didn't own that domain, while they did it for the other big wikis, like the World of Warcraft wiki or the Star Wars wiki, or Encyclopedia was also around back then. And we were both, well, not really active contributors anymore. So yeah, that kind of led to the transfer of the domain to Wikia. Would I do that today? Probably not. But yeah, that's what happened. Why wouldn't I do it today? Well, I mean, obviously they are making money from the wiki these days. So they're obviously a bit more business savvy maybe about this whole thing than we ever were. On the other hand, there are almost no independent wikis around these days. I know the Battlestar Galactica wiki was always independent, but that no longer exists. So it's very hard to do it. You have to dedicate a lot of time to it if you want to do it yourself. And I don't know.
I have a similar, gut feeling myself, is that I wish that I, had or took the time to spend more to maintain it, but with the resources that we had, with the time that we had available, it was something that, was not practical for us. At the time, we just thought it was just kind of a formality of, because Wikia had been hosting the website for at least 2 years by that point. They'd been hosting Memory Alpha. So we didn't really think all that much of it. I don't remember when they stopped using the Memory Alpha domain as the primary location for the wiki, and then just turned it into a redirect. Because there's that bit of ego that makes you want to say Memory Alpha should be its own thing, not just one of the bigger aspects of the fandom community of wikis. But at the same time, nobody is a fan, or very few people, I imagine, are a fan of just one single show. So having, Memory Alpha be part of that, just as an outsider perspective, not having been directly involved in running Memory Alpha or coordinating Memory Alpha lately, I do see the benefits of having it as it is. I wish there were fewer ads, a little bit less of the, Chrome and, widgets and doodads on the sides. But overall, I think it's done pretty well for, overall.
Do you think there would be an alternative for Memory Alpha on an independent service, like, I don't know, crowdfunded or even hosted by Paramount?
I would definitely not give it to Paramount. I don't think that would be very independent, and I'm not sure they are the best at hosting their own TV series on streaming platforms, let alone Memory Alpha. I think you could. I don't think they actually own the content any more than we do. So you can probably just take the content and host your own Memory Alpha under a new name. I think that has happened to a few wikis that split off from Wikia. I know it happened to WowWiki. They split off and became Wowpedia. That was very successful, although they are not independent anymore as well. You probably would have a problem directing traffic to your new Memory Alpha somehow, because the name
and also getting the participants and the contributors to move, because that would potentially be splitting the fans there.
Yeah, it would be splitting up the database as well. Like now you have 2 encyclopedias. It would be difficult.
So I think it's not out of the question. I see the potential benefits, but it's something that you'd have to be very careful about doing it and make sure that there's enough interest and demand. Whether it's worth it, it's one of those questions like the other things that we've said. I've gotten to the point where I can say we've made the best decisions with the information we had at the time.
Yeah, you're talking about splitting up the database and splitting up Memory Alpha. That's actually what happened in the German version, I think 4 or 5 years ago. And there was a discussion about some new features from fandom and the ever-growing advertisement on the pages, and no fandom staff member actually listened to them, and then they broke up. And someone downloaded the database, and then there is a new Memory Alpha for Germany and the actual fandom Memory Alpha. They are now running in parallel. Yeah, half of the users went away. They didn't stay with the fandom or with the independent website. They just went away. They were so frustrated from the whole discussion that they never came back to any of the projects.
Yeah,
that is a disappointment.
Sadly, it's part of how the internet works these days, that people used to make their own websites, and now if you're lucky, you make a Facebook group or you just use social media and nothing else. I think, the internet has changed a lot in those years as well.
Jan, you already said this. You were active not only on the German Memory Alpha, but also on some international Memory Alphas, including the English one. How many language versions did you contribute to?
So I mostly use this as setting inter-wiki links. So I remember that it started, of course, out with the English version, then we had the Dutch version, we had the German version, we had the Swedish version for a short time, but I think it never kicked off. We had a French version. As I said, we imported a complete dataset of a Spanish version, Portuguese. And so back then, remember when we could still download the database, I just did run a bot and had it all connected to each other so that you could switch the different languages, which probably then also helped. And okay, if that article is so incomplete, maybe I can have a look in the English version. Maybe it's more extensive there.
So you were just linking the articles between the languages. I had the idea that you would be fluent in 12 languages and contributing articles in these.
No, not so really. So I was able to read in the language what was supposed to be written and then apply also some wiki formatting, but mostly to show the newcomers there how this is done, and but no, I'm absolutely not fluent in anything else than German and English.
Do you know if Google Translate was a thing back then?
Could be, but I'm absolutely not sure. I recall that reading the Spanish stuff was actually easy to grasp because you had the knowledge what was supposed to be written in there. And with the Dutch stuff as well.
Harry, I think you were active in the Dutch version of Memory Alpha.
No, I actually never was. Well, I made an account. Maybe I did a few things, but I was never really active or involved with the Dutch Memory Alpha. It's also very strange to read about Star Trek in Dutch. I'm used to talking about Star Trek in English mostly.
Yeah, because you see the series and the films in English.
Yeah. Usually have subtitles. So if you want to write about it in Dutch, you actually have to translate it yourself, which is quite difficult. Like, what do you do with alien names?
Okay. Or the technobabble.
Oh, yeah. How does that work in Germany? Is there a group of people that make the official German translation for all this Star Trek stuff?
Well, the movies, but actually they follow quite a system. So for some very odd reason, for a very, very long time, we had all the Star Trek ranks in the English form, except for the ensign, where they used a completely unrelated name for this, in non-commissioned officers rank title for it. So they called him Fähnrich. Everything else is quite Germanized, so it's kind of the natural way how you translate stuff that's in there. In the very old, it's on the original series. There we had this system that the one TV station bought it and created a translation system, and they only bought 1/3 of the episodes randomly from all 3 seasons. So if you now watch them in sequence, at the one point, Captain Kirk says, let's go to Sol 5. And in the next episode, he says, let's go to Warp 5. And so for some reason, they translated stuff like this. But I mean, we have the lithium crystals, dilithium kristalle.
I think I can one-up you because the German television version of the original series. So the episodes were cut from, I think, 40 or 45 minutes back to 30 minutes. So you lost 15 minutes of time. So you have to leave out some things. And in one episode, actually, when Spock had his Ponfar, they cut the whole episode back and forth and changed the meaning because they were worried that all the innocent children were now confronted with Spock, who had some weird feelings, you understand. And so he had a space fever at the moment and he was sick, and this made no sense, well, howsoever. But nowadays you can get the original series on Blu-ray, I think. They remastered it. They recreated the special effects with computer graphics, and they recreated the dubbed or voice-overed missing pieces.
Yes, right. In the TV, it's now also that they broadcast the remastered versions only, and in one scene, just to cut, the voices are completely different.
Yeah, and in the Netherlands, you don't have that.
No, it was always broadcast in English, but with Dutch subtitles. But yeah, usually don't bother translating alien names or technology names. So even the subtitles, you just use the English words for that.
Yeah, but I think on the DVDs you also see or hear the different styles, how the different languages exist. And I think there's also a French dubbing.
Yeah, and actually about Blu-rays and DVDs, the Dutch DVD market has completely, well, almost disappeared. So when I have to buy like those 4K movie releases now, I have to buy the German releases because there are no Dutch releases anymore. Yeah, sadly. And the English ones from the UK, well, Brexit, that's too expensive. So yeah.
I understand that you can't buy a CD or a DVD or whatever physical media now in the brick and mortar store down the road, because for us in Germany, the CDs and DVDs disappeared, and Amazon has an online store and you can order that on this way. But there is no market for Dutch DVDs.
But I recall that my episodes of my first DVD set of the remastered series, I imported them from the Dutch because they were cheaper than buying in Germany.
Yeah.
For some odd reasons.
That's
And
interesting.
I was very worried that I might not have a German language track on there.
But usually you get the same European ones, I think. Yeah.
Did you play any Star Trek games? I can remember there was a first-person shooter at some time, or Star Trek Captain's Chair, I think it was named, where there was a simulation or something like this with the Enterprise.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh yes, I have. Actually, I think I still have the Captain's Chair disc somewhere. And there was the Omnipedia, which was basically the Star Trek encyclopedia on CD. That was such a great thing to interact with. The first Star Trek game I played, I've never been one for first-person shooters, but I did have the Star Trek 25th Anniversary computer game. Which was that seriously pixelated, maybe it was 8-bit or 16-bit computer graphics. I didn't even have the version with the audio. Yeah, the adventure game, the puzzles. And that was my first Star Trek game.
Was that the one with Trelane in the Red Baron, or was that in Judgment Right?
I think that was Judgment Rights. The one that I had was, it had Harry Mudd. It was similar in style, though.
Yeah, I bought my very first computer with the excuse that I want to play Klingon Honor Guard or so, and still it didn't really work quite well. Yeah, the Voyager ego shooter, that was quite successful.
Elite Force or something?
Elite Force, yeah. I think
they also had a mod for this, a TOS theme. So
yeah, I remember that's the one I played. Yeah, you could.
Yeah.
Dan has a collection.
Dan is standing up to install it now, and
I just realized I know where they are.
we have the evening on the online server with each other.
I just realized I have some of them here. There's the ship. I found my captain's chair disc.
Yes, nice.
Great.
Yes, and I remember this one was so neat. The Starship Creator.
Oh, that was a
and it was-
rip-off. That was a
It
total
was.
rip-off. But it
was a
you,
neat
you
idea, but it
and you could download the database from there. It had a lot of names for all the different characters. They invented first names that were never used anywhere else, but
all made up.
yeah. But the other gameplay I never really grasped, so I didn't understand the concept there. Did you have the one that was based on Farsa, Starfleet Command? Starfleet Command?
Yeah, Starfleet Command 3 or something. I think I played for a while. And I very briefly played Star Trek Online, but they have an important role these days as the provider of starships.
I played Elite Force, and I had the captain's chair with all those quick time movie events, but other than that, I evaded Star Trek games because I had the idea that a licensed game would be a bad game, because many games with movie licenses were just, bullcrap. Let's say this. And the 25th anniversary adventure I never played. I think I didn't have a PC back then. I had an Amiga, and that's the reason why I didn't play this.
Yeah, I've always been a Mac person, so the gaming availability on the Mac has been mixed over the years. Some of them were there, and then just like Elite Force they made for the Mac, I just never, got too interested in that particular one. So, yeah, I've never been a huge computer gamer or even a console gamer myself. So, a few here and there, but not many.
And role-playing? Back then, there was a big... it's a rich background material that they designed in the 80s for Farsa. Did you ever consider these?
Relatively recently. I have a friend who still has some of the FASA materials, so we do a regular RPG night, and for a few months, we did a Star Trek role-play. That was a very fun way to pass the time, because most of us were Star Trek fans. I also have between us we've got a couple of the tabletop Star Trek games. There's one called Fleet Captains that is really fun for any Starship nerd, and there's another one called Ascendancy.
Can you describe that for me? Because I have no idea about role-playing. How can I imagine that? Do you sit at the table and then invent your ideas? Or is it like a board game? Or
they're the board games, basically. So Fleet Captains, there's a bunch of miniature ships, and you lay out a bunch of cards all face down to represent the galaxy. And as you explore, you flip the cards over to find out what's in that star system. And then, of course, there's a combat aspect to it. So you're playing Starfleet, you might run up against the Klingons or the Romulans, and you fight it out, too. And then there's all sorts of events for exploration. You might end up meeting Q or the Tribbles. So that's Fleet Captains. It takes up a fair amount of time to set up with all the cards you have to lay out, but it's really fun. And then Ascendancy is a bit like, it's almost a bit like Civilization in a way. It sounds similar at first because you start with one star system and then you're exploring and, going out into the galaxy, but it's more on the strategic level rather than the tactical level. So you're building your colonies, setting up trading agreements with the other, alien empires that are around you. So those are the two tabletop board game style that I've played.
Did you ever hear about a card game, not a board game, but a card game named, I have it here in my hands, you can't see it because the communication cam went out. It's named Star Trek The Next Generation Customizable Card Game.
Never played that one, but I've definitely seen a lot of the cards and pictures.
Yeah.
Do you know Magic the Gathering?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hearing.
then you understand the idea. So you have to buy booster pack after booster pack after booster pack. I I bought, I think, 5, 6, 7 pounds of cards. I can't count them. I just weighed them. I found them in the basement today, and you can hear this. This is the limited edition collector's tin box with a certificate of authenticity. And I have number 29,099.
Very limited.
Yeah, I think it's worth a fortune today, maybe €5 or 6, I don't know. And I even went to a tournament. I felt I had bought enough cards, and but I've never played the game. I think that was the problem with me, because I was the second to last in the tournament. So I lost, I think, every game except for one, maybe? I don't know. I can't recall this. So everyone was called to the stage to get the trophy and so on and so on. And even the last guy, so the last in the tournament, got a trophy. That was my time with a card game based on Star Trek. I think the cards are very beautiful. So they have a very interesting idea on mixing the stories from Next Generation with the card game. I think they invented a first season or first series of cards and then played around a little bit with the rules. And then they had another series of cards. But I think in the third year of production, they just quit it and never released anything again.
Yeah. I also play a lot of board games and I love them, but I don't actually have any Star Trek related board games. But yeah, Ascendancy looks interesting. Maybe I should. I have the same thing, what you said about video games. Usually licensed games are a bit, well, we have the license, let's quickly make a game, that's it. But I know a few, Star Trek Frontiers is another one. It's based on another game, basically a reskin of quite a good game. But problem is I have the original game, so.
Other than that, what's your biggest collectible?
I have a few of those old books. I love I collected a lot of those, like 80s fandom starship manuals, the ships of the Starfleet, and the Star Trek maps. That's a little earlier, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Federation reference series, that kind of stuff. For a long time, this is after Memory Alpha, I was in all sorts of Facebook groups with actually those people and other fans of that work. And we did a lot of like starship drawing and making up histories, all with the idea like what happens to Star Trek if you just take the original series and nothing else, like actually build on that, because they say a lot of things that have been changed in later series, but if you take just the original series at face value, they have a few interesting things. Like at one point they say, well, Vulcans and humans didn't work together for very long, so if you just take that, then you can almost build another version of Star Trek that's just that, which is quite interesting. I did that for a while. So yeah, I collected a lot of those books. I had a few of those models here, the AMT models. Yeah, that was fun. But I think, yeah, the most interesting things, probably the Starfleet technical manual, the first edition one, and the Star Trek maps, just because it's a really beautiful thing.
I'm also, I was very much into building the AMT models when I was in high school, and I've gotten back into that since the pandemic. started. So I got a few model kits, some of them the official licensed AMT. I got a few resin kits as well, the ones that I can kind of assemble and paint myself. So that's been kind of a fun pastime.
Yeah, and then of course we have the Eagle Moss models these days.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I had to limit myself to just buying original series stuff because
So tempting. So tempting.
Can't have all.
Don't have enough space for them all.
No, my house is enough Star Trek and Lego, so I can't put it everywhere.
Speaking of Lego, do you know the new Lego series? Not Lego. It's I don't know what the English word is, but in German we have to say Klemmbaustein. It's from one of the competitors, Blue Bricks, I think.
Fake Lego, you mean? No.
No. I mean,
yeah, I know.
The patent has expired, and so other companies are now using it. And they one of the companies has a nice collection of new stuff there.
They have the Star Trek license, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
I don't have any of that. No. What's that brand again? Blue
Bricks, I think.
Yeah, it's Blue Bricks, and they have several models. I think in two sizes. So it's display size or a smaller like play around with size. Yeah, I remember one time I wanted to assemble my model kit for an USS Enterprise D, which was illuminated, and the problem was the model came with a drill. And the drill head was, I think, less than 1 millimeter in thickness because all the fiber optics had to stick in the hole, and I think I broke the drill head. Other than that, I had the Deep Space Nine as a model. I think Deep Space Nine, and I think that's it. Yeah.
I have the Enterprise C somewhere in bits. I have the Enterprise D with the nacelles came off. I have the Cardassian ship when the little saucer also came off.
You know that you can combine all the parts and bits to a completely new ship that's called, I think, kit bashing.
Yeah, Wolf 359 ship. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true.
As far as people, contributing, I wonder if part of it is there is a heck of a lot more Star Trek now. 2019 is when Lower Decks started coming out, right? So I wonder if it's just that because there's more and more, it's harder to keep track of it all. At least there's the perception of that, perhaps, because technically we're not really getting much more Star Trek, or at least last year in 2022, we had about 50 or 51 episodes. And that's about the same number as what we had in the average year when we had two series, whether it was, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, when two of those shows were running concurrently. So it's not that there's all that much more. It just feels like it's more in a way because there's more series, different stories. And so there's more to keep track of. And so maybe some people are just feeling like a little burned out from trying to keep track of it all. Just speculating there.
Talking of Lower Decks, that might actually be one of my favorite new series.
Oh, I love Lower Decks. Lower Decks and Strange New Worlds are my two favorites.
Yeah. I suspect they actually add things just so they get to write about it on Memory Alpha. I wonder where it's going because Discovery is now, is canceled the right word, or at least it's ending?
I'd say canceled because they weren't planning to end the show.
Okay.
So that's how I would put it.
I really enjoyed the last season. I thought moving the story to the far future and actually coming up with a new style for Starfleet and stuff like that was really interesting.
I very much enjoyed Discovery as well. There's, different things that I feel clash with my own preconceptions of the show, but I love a lot of the characters. I love the messages that they have, especially as the show has gone on. So I am very sad to see it go.
Yeah. And I wonder what it means for like the big connected universe ideas they seemingly had or have. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what the production will bring? It's everybody seems to want to cut costs now, at least for a while. There'll be another cycle soon enough, I hope. Star Trek survived 2 droughts already. I know we'll be okay.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, probably it was also live on in books and novels and stuff like this. Not that I have touched them, but yeah. I think that was always what kept it alive.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending. Thank you for answering, because I actually got in touch with a lot of people to join me.
Yeah, it was very interesting indeed. So thanks, Florian, for setting this up, for having this idea, for bringing us all together.
Well, Florian, thank you so much for organizing this, because, when we started Memory Alpha, we never really, we just had an idea of a project. It was something we wanted to do, and there was no end in sight. It wasn't something where we would ever think, okay, we're done. But the fact that it's continued is just a testament to how many people love the show and have this common interest and just want to, share and, share the things that they've noticed and also pick up on the things that everybody else has noticed in the show.
It's a miracle for me that this website was so dramatically increasing in purpose and in value for the production side of Star Trek over the years. So 20 years in the making, and it is now something in the toolbox of the writers' room. And I think this is very, it's a unique thing, I think.
Yeah, and it's powered by the fans, really. So that's really interesting. It's like a feedback loop of some kind. Yeah. And I think we should also thank all the contributors over the years that have actually written all these articles for us and for the whole community. So, yeah.
There are 70,000, more than 17,000 users on the Memory Alpha in English, with one or more contributions. It's a large number.
Yeah, we definitely didn't have that in mind in 2003. But yeah, very happy that it worked out, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I figured it would be a few dozen people that would contribute.
Yeah,
and then
basically
it just kept on going and going.
The guys in that Flare topic, those people would write a few articles, and then we'd move on to the next database. Yeah.
What do you think the vision of Star Trek would be in 20 years, or your vision of your life would be in 20 years?
For Star Trek, I would say that it's going to continue to be a reflection of our hopes and our fears. And I think that's part of why Star Trek, there's been a lot of discussion about what we have currently. Discovery, in a way, I think is a reflection of our fears over the last, 5 to 8 years of everything happening in the world. And then how do we react to that? How do we hold on to what makes us human in that type of a world? And so, in a way, I think that because Star Trek is aspirational, it's really hard to predict exactly what it will be like. But I think there's always something that we're striving for. So Star Trek, whatever it looks like, Memory Alpha, I think it can keep on going as long as there's a place to support it. And as we discussed earlier, if, the corporation has an issue, thankfully, because of the structure, we can still recreate it and move on and build it. And somebody can. So I think at this point it may have, a potentially indefinite life. That doesn't mean infinite, but indefinite. Who knows how long it'll go?
Yeah, I think what you said is right. Star Trek is always a reflection of the time where it's made in. And I also think Star Trek is at its most interesting when it's trying new things. telling new stories. But yeah, it can do so many things. Like one of the things that Discovery actually showed us is you can tell the same story again or in a different setting, or it's not all as fixed as it sometimes looks. So yeah, I think there can be a whole lot more Star Trek in the next 20 years.
Yeah, so the original Star Trek was just a Western in a different setting. So Star Trek will always reinvent itself and give the current generation the Star Trek that is living there. We saw the reinvention with The Next Generation, a small variation with Deep Space Nine, and then again with Enterprise, trying to fit in somewhere in the universe, but being adapted to that time. And also the new movies are essentially the very same approach, always taking that theme and putting it in a current generation.
So Star Trek is ever evolving, but always staying the same. And connected with the reality and with the time, and time is changing, so Star Trek is changing. Thank you for your participation and thank you for your kind words for me. I hope I see you soon. And for the viewers, thank you for watching, and maybe there will be a second or a third season. Okay. See you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks, Florian.